Kim Wallace from Social Enterprise Scotland. We are recording the session this afternoon, so Kirsty's just hit record. If you don't want to appear in the recording, please just switch your camera off. I'm also going to ask you just to keep your mics on mute unless you're talking. Obviously, you can take it off then. It just helps a bit with the background noise. Kirsty is going to share the agenda. I'll just run through what we're going to cover this afternoon. So this afternoon's session is split into two parts. First of all, we're going to talk about the 10-year strategy and action plan. We're going to hear some reflections from Chris Raftery first from Scottish Government, and then from Douglas Westwater, who'll give some sector reflections on the action plan. And then we're going to and I'll hand over to Douglas to chair that bit of this afternoon's session. I think it's really timely for us to be looking at the strategy and action plan, given we're now in the final year of the second action plan and looking towards the final action plan for the 10-year strategy. We're going to have plenty of time following the two speakers for questions and also some discussion. We'll be inviting some reflections from the floor as well. So in the usual format, please do share any questions or comments that you have in the chat, and we'll do our very best to cover as many of them as we can. After the two speakers will be quite informal, so we really just want to get a discussion going. So without any further ado, I'm going to invite Chris Raftery to give us his reflections. Chris.
Thank you. Thanks, Kim. And thank you for inviting me to speak with you this afternoon. Good to see some familiar faces and names for folk who've not got the cameras on. For those who don't know me, I'm Chris Raftery. I head up the Enterprise and Third Sector team within Scottish Government. Now, this was primarily focused on social enterprise, but we've broadened the remit to recognise a lot of the organisations that undertake social entrepreneurial activity don't necessarily recognise themselves as social enterprise, and also to bring closer alignment with social investment activity that we undertake. For us, the unique selling point of social enterprise is that, as you know, it's about seeking to make profits, but also committing to reinvest in those within a social mission, for example, delivering local community projects or services, creating employment for disadvantaged people, or protecting the environment. Social enterprise plays a pivotal role in delivering on our key outcomes as set out in the National Performance Framework, making Scotland a more successful country with opportunities to create sustainable and inclusive growth whilst reducing inequalities and increase well-being for all. So this current action plan was originally developed over 3 years ago now, but when we came to publish it, COVID happens, the timing was really did clash with that. This presented a number of challenges to us all. Not only during COVID, there was unprecedented restrictions on our personal movements, but also for many, we had to adapt to how we do business and how we collectively support our communities. With the sector, we revisited the action plan in light of the pandemic. What was reassuring was that not a lot was actually changed, but what we thought was most important collectively was the values and principles had never been more important that were within the action plan itself, which comes from the way that social enterprise approach their work. Not long after the action plan was launched, COVID is still around. We found ourselves in another challenging time, which was the current economic and cost of living crisis. And whilst COVID, I think, taught us that we have the ability to tackle problems head on and find creative and innovative ways of overcoming challenges, the economic and cost of living crisis will mean that we have to continue to look to overcome different challenges whilst continuing to support those most in need within our communities. What's been proven over the last few years certainly is that the social enterprise sector is a resilient one. The skills, drive and determination that you've brought about to your social enterprise businesses puts each of you in a position where you can showcase your abilities and talents to the full, leading Scotland's businesses as we face the future together and tackle the challenges ahead. However, as a sector has changed and developed over the course of the last 2 action plans, so is society. You don't need me to talk about the additional pressures that you would have seen on your key services that both COVID and the cost of living crisis has brought about. Thankfully, over time, we've seen investment into to support the foundations that has created the Scottish ecosystem. I'll let Douglas talk more about that in a few minutes. But this has helped support the sector during these tough times. And whilst I appreciate that it may not feel like it at times, especially on an individual organisational perspective, we do still have a world-leading social enterprise. We are a world-leading social enterprise nation with a world-leading ecosystem and support for social enterprise, and it's recognised as such. And this is due to features such as national incubation programs, free business support, and a variety of social finance options, amongst many others, which again I think Douglas will touch on later on in terms of the tube map. The Scottish Government published a 10-year social enterprise strategy to ensure the movement, this movement realises its full potential, co-produced with the social enterprise sector, and that was launched in 2016. In March 2021, we published the second of the 3 years, which takes us up to 2024, with the aim to ensure that the social enterprise model was at the heart of Scotland's recovery from the pandemic. Now the context, I think, with between the second action plan and the first, I think the first was quite a stable environment. And as a country, I think we've the period of the last one has been, for some reasons I've mentioned, has been much more unstable. But this action plan was more about reasserting our long-term vision of social enterprise being at the forefront of a new wave of ethical and socially responsible business in Scotland, far-reaching and becoming central to the way that Scotland chooses to do business. The action plan sets out how Scottish Government, in partnership with social enterprise sector, will work towards 3 key priorities of the strategy, and they're stimulating social enterprise, developing stronger organisations, and realising market opportunity. Like the initial social enterprise strategy, the action plan was co-produced with the sector, and it's a roadmap that's created by the sector for the sector. The delivery of the action plan is supported by a steering group, and this is something that's happened over the course of this action plan rather than the first, made up of sector representatives and underpinned by a number of subgroups. Currently, the key themes of them are fair work, the environment, social impact measurement, and equalities, diversity and inclusion. Now, they have, to a greater or lesser extent, taken some time to get structured, and with the output to them, I think we'll be seeing more in the future, and I suspect that may continue as part of the next action plan, but that's obviously still to be developed. Some of you may not know that government spend on social enterprise directly comes from what is within the action plan. So if it's not within the action plan, it doesn't get funded. So that's why the development of the next one is particularly important. But some of the key areas of this one is core funding for social enterprise Scotland, representative body, business support for the sector, which is delivered by the sector for the sector through Just Enterprise, startup help or for organisations looking to trade maybe for the first time or more sustainably to grow their services through the Accelerate programme. There's also financial support through the likes of Fairsport, Social Investment Scotland and Challenges, whilst also developing our social entrepreneurs of the future through the Academy School programme. All of that comes through the existing action plan, which has been funded accordingly. The first action plan focused very much on a lot of building the foundations. The current one is more with a view to transitioning towards more mainstream social enterprise as a business model on an equal footing with all business models. Now, has this been a success? Everyone will have their own opinion, and hopefully they'll all have an opinion based on having read the action plan to start with. One thing I would say though is no one action point are born equal. There's somewhere a bit of finance can lead to a really good outcome, but then there's some things that are looking at much bigger structural issues which take a lot longer to deliver. So it's obviously a mixed bag. Some of the successes, we've accelerated the schools program, so more children quicker will get access to social enterprise experience in their school career. We've expanded the offering of what is the Accelerate program as well, which was based on some of the success of our COVID response. Through First Port and at its launch with the support of CES, we supported the Catalyst Fund, supporting growth ready but not loan ready organisations to reach their potential. And that we've achieved that. There's lots of other things as well I won't have time to go through. So, but very quickly, I'll just pull up two things where I think we maybe need to do more or could do better. Well, the first, I would personally like to have done more from an equalities perspective. The business support contract is heavy on these requirements, heavier than it's ever been, but we'd like to have gone further with that. We'd like to have gone further with some of the grant making that we do as well. A lot of it is already there, but as I say, we could go further to do that, and I think that hopefully will be a focus moving forward. Also, like to have seen was affect the policy landscape across government much more, so that social enterprise support isn't necessarily niche, but policies developed with social enterprise in mind on an equal footing with charities or SMEs, and so on and so forth. So that leads me on to the next action plan. I think the next one should really focus on the mainstreaming of social enterprise support. Controversially, I know one thing we did deliver over the course of the action plan was a single intermediary for the sector. One of the reasons for government undertaking this was to increase the influence of social enterprise across the public sector. I know CES will acknowledge there's a period of transition to go through, and we always expected that would be the case, and I'm sure everyone here will support that. However, one of the benefits of a single intermediary is that we've been able to give CES the lead role for developing the next action plan. Scottish Government help, we will support it, we'll make sure it gets ministerial sign-off for publication, have the Scottish Government stamp, that sort of thing, but it'll be CES in partnership with this sector that very much leads on that, which I think sets us up for hopefully a positive next few years as we move forward. I'm going to stop there, I think, so that's probably me about time, and I'll pass you over to Douglas, but thank you.
Much, Chris, for that overview. I think it's given us good context for the discussion that will follow. So without any further ado, I'll introduce Douglas Westwater to give his perspective. Please remember just to share any comments or questions in the chat box, and we'll cover them off next. Douglas?
Grant, yeah, thank you. I'm just looking to share my screen. Oh, you've shared it already, Grant. Okay, thank you. Okay, yeah, I think I just wanted to do a bit of a. Sorry, Kel, are you going to press over this slide? I'm going to have to wink or nod or something.
Kirsty.
Kirsty, all right, it's Kirsty, Grant, Kirsty. Okay, right. Okay, well, I'll do a big wink every time I need you to the slide. But so yeah, I just wanted to give a bit of an overview of the ecosystem itself that Chris referred to, and hopefully a couple of questions along the way. I mean, obviously, feel free to make any comments or questions, but it just might stimulate some discussion. I've been thinking a little around the history of community and social enterprise in Scotland, and as Chris said, with all its flaws and all its difficulties, Scotland's genuinely a leader in all of this. And I was just reflecting back on that community business as it was at the time, around in the 80s. So Scotland was again ahead of the game around then, and people like CIS, ourselves, others. There was an infrastructure of organisations then, which was very innovative, and community businesses was starting to develop. There was a lot of growing activity on the ground, and as that moved on, there was beginning to be a rise of representative bodies like SENSCOT and Development Trust Association and so on. And I just was remembering, well, probably talking 16, 17 years ago, being asked to go and talk about social enterprise as a model to a couple of conferences, community-based and health-based organisations. And there was a near riot because they felt they were trying to turn them into horrible private sector right-wing businesses, and I think those days have really moved on, and as Chris said, has begun to be a standard model, and that really moved on to the Enterprising Third Sector Action Plan, which was a recognition that enterprising innovation could work right across the third sector, and that really raised the awareness of social enterprise as a model. And then, of course, just now we have the co-produced social enterprise strategy. Thanks, Kirsty. Okay, yeah, we can go back to that. So yeah, I think why I think it's going to be fairly powerful at the moment is that before social enterprise felt very much a model developing on its own and a way to sustain the third sector, but the Scottish Government over the last number of years have really focused a lot on making private sector businesses more ethical, and concepts around mission-led businesses and B Corps and so on, and insisting on things like fair work and social benefit clauses and contracting. Now, none of this is perfect, but in terms of a policy drive, there is a drive towards making the third sector itself more innovative, more entrepreneurial and more sustainable. But there's also a drive to make the private sector nicer and more ethical and impacting more in their communities and being mindful more of the impact that they have. So that combination of that move from the private sector towards some being more ethical and the third sector to being more entrepreneurial is encompassed really beautifully in social enterprise. I think we're at a really strong place in the development of the economy, having looked after social enterprise. Kirsty. Well, that's still going the wrong way, still going forward. Next one. Yeah. So the big vision that I wanted people to reflect on, and so that was in the 10-year strategy in 2016, set out and was over the next decade, social enterprise will be at the forefront of a new wave of ethically and socially responsible businesses in Scotland. It will become a far-reaching and valued alternative and a key part of the Scottish way of doing business. So I think it'd be interesting today to hear people's views. How far towards that vision have we got over the last few years since 2016? As Chris mentioned, we're obviously been through a pandemic. We've been through Brexit, which wasn't expected at this point. We've been through a cost of living crisis with the costs of running a social enterprise being really quite challenging. So we aren't on a very positive trajectory at the moment, and I think some of it might be that success isn't a massive growth, but just maintaining where we are as a sector is success in itself in terms of looking at some of those contexts. So it'd be quite good for you for us together to reflect on, well, how far have we got towards this big vision, and how do we develop the next social enterprise action plan to help us to get closer to that. Kirsty. Oh, grand. So as that was developed, this ecosystem in Scotland has been developed through the last two social enterprise action plans. I think there's a lot of questions to be asked. There's been a lot of detailed debate. Nobody's suggesting it's perfect, but I think over that period of time, it has begun to be a coordinated programme of support to social enterprises and to the third sector to support that sustainability at grassroots level. So as part of that ecosystem, we've got a significant amount of development support through Just Enterprise was mentioned, but there's a range of other supports out there. So there's a significant amount of development support to organisations. There's a lot of funding and finance, the grant funding, some funding for new entrepreneurs, there's loan finance, a catalyst fund, some innovative funding. So there's finance and funding in there. Learning is really important. The academy, the work that the School for Social Entrepreneurs does, the training that's with Just Enterprise, a whole range of learning, leadership training and development. Networking is something that might be worth discussing. It's taken a bit of a hit with the move of the intermediaries, I think, at the moment, but networking across the geographical and the thematic networks, and a really, really important part of the ecosystem as we develop. And then policy and information, making sure that you have a strong intermediary with Social Enterprise Scotland, the information's out there and policies out there. So this ecosystem, I think, as it develops, is incredibly important. I had a call today from somebody who was really struggling, who's clicked on our emergency button this morning. They're on the verge of insolvency. They're in really very serious trouble. I'm speaking to Roddy today, and we're going to see if we can assist them with some of the support here that exists already in the ecosystem. But one of the main things for her was, well, I wish I'd known about this 6 months ago. So we have an issue as an ecosystem delivering this, making sure that it gets out there for the people who need it and can see it best. So this is going to, so trying to articulate what the ecosystem is in Scotland, difficult though it is, and I do remember there's community enterprise seem to be fairly decent friends with most people, but I think most people fell out with us over this map because the font wasn't big enough, or they weren't near enough the centre, or so it's tricky to articulate that whole ecosystem that Chris mentioned that we've developed over the last few years. But I think one of the things that we wanted to point out most importantly is that it should be collaborating. It's not silos of somebody providing funding, somebody providing business support, somebody providing supporting new entrepreneurs, someone else working with schools. I think the vision for this ecosystem, and I think we've got a bit of way to go here, is to take what we've got, improve it, make it accessible for people, but also collaborate and work much better together. Kirsty, if memory serves me, I think you need to go back to that slide that I've actually moved in my version of this. Yeah, so second last slide before we just open up for questions and thoughts. We've obviously moved that ecosystem of support with all the funding and business support, working with individuals and schools and all those different perspectives, assets, linking out to support that's funded elsewhere, so funding through regeneration and other departments of government and other grant funders, other ways of funding, so working in partnership across those other levels. But we are in a period of severe change. I don't need to tell anybody here about that. In terms of some of those challenging things, we have had COVID, Brexit, that cost of living rise affecting both sales, but also the costs for enterprises. Funding availability has got under severe pressure. So there's quite a lot of serious challenges out there at the moment. But we are in a context politically where we're focusing on, or nationally, we're focusing on a well-being economy, on community wealth building. Issues with procurement are always there, but there is a political will to open up procurement opportunities. Community empowerment's been with us for a while, but that concept of communities being in control of the assets and the services that matter to them, and although it would appear a negative thing, local authorities, churches and so on, divesting themselves of assets at an enormous rate, is creating a potential opportunity for us as well in social enterprise. So it's a real period of change with some challenges and some opportunities. And Kirsty, if you can just move to the last slide and then we'll finish up. So as well as looking at that question as how far have we got along the road towards that big vision for social enterprise, which was articulated in 2016, through all that difficult period that we've experienced. Just some thoughts from me. Feel free to ignore them and come up with your own thoughts and comments. But for me, looking at that ecosystem that's been developed so far has been positive, but it has real difficulties and real challenges. So how do we ensure that it's equal and extensive and easy access for the support, so the people who need it can get access to that easily? How do we enable all those delivery partners that deliver that support can collaborate more effectively? How do we make sure that we collaborate out with that sector? So there's a lot of work that Kim and the team and Brian are looking at the private sector and also that wider third sector that wouldn't view themselves as social enterprises. How do we collaborate with all of those? And then finally, how do we respond to change in the sector as we go forward? As we've seen from the last couple of action plans, things don't stay the same. So creating an ecosystem needs to be solid, it needs to be established, but it also needs to be hugely flexible and changeable to adapt to circumstances as they change. So feel free to use those thoughts or come up with your own thoughts and comments, and I'll just close there and back to Kim. Thank you, Kirsty.
Thanks, Douglas. I always love a presentation when we get the tube map included. Okay, I'm just going to open up firstly for any direct questions to either Douglas or Chris following what you've just heard, and then hopefully we'll get a bit of a discussion going as well. So this is your chance. If you want to just raise your hand if you've got a question, please just introduce yourself, who you are and where you're from, and we'll kick off. Pauline Hinchin. Oh,
I am Pauline Hinchin, and I'm from Scottish Communities Finance. And thanks to both Douglas and Chris for the overview, because sometimes it seems like such a long time ago that we did these things that we've forgotten the detail, even when it was only 3 years ago. But we're all post-COVID brains at the moment, which means everything seems a very long time ago. So just a couple of things really in terms of what Chris was saying predominantly, which is, Chris, you very generously kind of highlighted where maybe things weren't as strong or things didn't happen perhaps in a way that maybe you anticipated in terms of the plans versus the reality. But I suppose one of the things I think we should talk about is climate change, and how we move that into the sector, because it's still proven to be very difficult, even with the work that third sector Net Zero Group is doing. Still very difficult to try and engage particularly organizations that aren't doing environmental stuff in that agenda. But yes, it's getting obvious year by year that we have to come to grips with it. And I suppose the other thing is in relation to just the slide that Douglas had. And so, Chris, if you want to come back with that, that'd be, if you have any comments. But coming back to what Douglas was saying, Douglas, I think the one thing you were missing about partnerships is increasingly is the role of philanthropy beyond just giving out grants, and the role of philanthropy in taking risk into the sector and taking some investment and stuff. And speaking just my own personal experience, it's something that we're increasingly aware of and speaking to them about. And I suppose, is there a scope for us to shape potentially that engagement in a way that is a bit more entrepreneurial from my perspective anyway? Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Pauline. Chris, do you want to take that first in the environment, and then Douglas over to you on the philanthropy question?
Yeah, I think the environment questions is an interesting one, and I think this is just my personal take on a broad basis. Both the sector and us as a government, we're guilty of it as well. Have for a wee while perpetuated the idea that we're at the forefront of tackling climate change, and that might well be the case for organisations that are set up for that as the social mission. But what I think is potentially lacking, which I think is where you're coming from, Pauline, perhaps, is organisations who that isn't their primary social mission, isn't necessarily taking that as serious and thinking, well, that's somebody else's problem. Whereas we're maybe more in the private sector, because there's financial gain to be made from that. I know there's greenwashing and all of that, but they need to be seen to be doing that for their own business. They need to be seen to be greener, etc. And I think there's something probably for the next action plan, which is around being realistic where the sector is and the support that the sector may actually require to do that, especially for organisations whose primary purpose isn't a climate change, environment type social mission. But that should probably be included in any social enterprise moving forward, just as it should be for any organisation, whether public, private or social.
Thanks, Chris. I get to do this because I'm chairing. I'm going to put Yvonne McBride on the spot a wee bit, if you don't mind, Yvonne. Could you maybe share what you're doing in South Lanarkshire with the climate change, the scorecard?
Sure. So I'm Yvonne McBride. I used to work in the sector in St Scott with Kim and some others in the room, but I'm now working at South Lanarkshire Council. And we have just last week signed off our social enterprise strategy. Although we've been working on it for the past year around some of the actions and are already delivering. One of the programmes that Kim was referring to is the Climate Confident South Lanarkshire pilot. So we have pulled together a sort of programme, if you like, which is linked into the national pilot around developing a scorecard for the sector to give them that snapshot of where they currently are. So a sort of simple 10-minute process really to give you your sort of spider diagram to see where you need to do sort of immediate actions around that to make a start on the journey. And following on from that, then there's a couple of workshops planned for August, which will go into sort of specific areas of where you can get support and where you can begin to address and sort of build the links and build capacity around tackling some of the actions that are relevant to you, obviously. And just going back to Chris's point around those organisations that will be part of this. So yeah, we're very much of a mind that we want to not only include those organisations that have a specific environmental purpose, but organisations wider than that as well. And that's the whole just transition element, if you like, for us. Moving on from the sort of initial scorecard and workshops, there'll be an online tool, a pathway that will get into much more depth, much more detail, and provide you with a sort of full action plan. And as a local authority as well, we've brought on stream a number of funding sources that can support the journey through, and obviously targeting and tailoring our existing business support. So we're hoping there's about 30 organisations will go through that. We're currently sitting at 16 that have signed up, so looking to bring a few more on board. But as a pilot, it's new for us. We want to test it, and I suppose a part of the beauty as well that it does link into the national, so we've got a bit of comparison with what's happening across Scotland.
That's great, thanks Yvonne. Douglas, will come to you for the second part of Pauline's question, and then Ailsa will take a question from you.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'll just be brief. Actually, that's really interesting question, Pauline. I think when we certainly said linking out with the sector to third sector and private sector, it certainly wasn't an exhaustive list. It was just basically linking with everybody across everybody, you know. I think in terms of interest linked with philanthropists, they're a very specific thing I think we can be thinking about and developing. People will probably know that with the DTAS and Scottish Community Alliance and Just Enterprise, we've developed, well, we put out the this emergency button, really not to do anything. It's not a new programme, it's just by way of finding people that might be struggling a wee bit more easily. We've had about a dozen in the last 10 days or so requests, 3 or 4 probably okay, and we just put them into the mainstream programme. 6 or 7 to a different extent are really in very serious trouble. So a couple I've spoken to, they actually are in trouble, but they could probably really redevelop, restructure, look at what they're doing. They've got some opportunities going ahead, but they need a little bit of money, 10, 20,000 kind of money to get them over this difficult hump. Otherwise they're going to go insolvent. But actually if they get over that, there's light at the end of the tunnel and they'd be fine. You know, applying for grants, 3 or 4 months assessment is impossible, and going to traditional loan funders, Kieran, no offence to assist at all, have their own, but it's just very hard to go to a traditional, even a social impact loan funder, because this just looks too dodgy. So that sort of philanthropic funding, people who would think, flip, yeah, I can see a difference my money would make and I can put it in next week, I think is a massive gap, and to complement some of those other things. So I'd be really interested to speak to you, Pauline, about that. I think there's a real opportunity there to use some clever money to help people through a difficult period. But that's just one example, but thanks for that.
Thanks, Douglas. Ailsa, do you want to come in?
Hi, thanks, Kim. Hopefully you can hear me. There's a lot of drilling and construction work outside, but just a couple of reflections. I think in terms of where we're at compared to where we were when we wrote those statements, which feels like a lifetime ago, I think there's a much greater recognition and appetite for a more socially responsible and environmental conscious society as a whole. I think, though, that's within a wider context where the inequalities continue to grow, and those that are very, very wealthy get more and more wealthy on a daily basis. And that's where all the power is. So I think there's still a huge amount of work to influence and ensure systems change to address those key challenges. I think when we talk about the ecosystem, we sometimes fail to remember that there's a huge amount of knowledge and expertise in the sector as it is, and it's not just the support organisations that have that knowledge and capability to provide that support. And I think, you know, through some of the small amounts of funding that have been available to support things like knowledge exchange, that has really enabled and empowered those working on the ground to share that knowledge and expertise and support each other and build really valuable relationships. And I think where one of the gaps is in terms of where we're at as a country as well is the real issue of not being able to really go beyond our borders very much with that knowledge exchange. And I think the impact of Brexit in terms of bringing some of that wider knowledge and expertise from across Europe is a huge impact for many organisations working on the ground. So just really to add that into the mix, and I think it is something that it would be of huge value if we can consider how that can be included in the next action plan as well.
Thanks, Ailsa. I think that's really important in terms of that kind of learning from other places. And I know over the years that we've certainly gained a lot of knowledge through particularly European funded projects that we worked on previously. And that's really, I think we're feeling the loss of that now. Don't know, Douglas or Chris, if you've got any response to that.
I think I don't want to take up too much time because other people want to speak. Just to say, I would agree with Ailsa. I think the intelligence on the ground is hugely important. We certainly in our day-to-day work link people constantly, rather than just telling them what to do, just link people up who've experienced it. And that the exchange that the Scottish Community Alliance run, as we use all the time, is incredibly important. So, and that international stuff is just depressing to think about, Ailsa. So yeah, so thanks for that.
Thank you. Jenna, do you want to come in?
Hi, forgive me as I'm positioning this question as we go. I just want to know whether the sector is set up enough to innovate and what people think about that broadly, because having reached the social category social enterprise final in Scottish Edge, is there enough happening in Scotland for early stage, high growth potential, tech focused, innovative businesses that can scale up and prove? Like the Josiah Lockharts, who would say to me in the beginning, Jenna, show Scotland how best it is to do business as a social enterprise. And then you're in some groups with universities and it's all about getting early funding and innovating. And are we attracting social investment as social enterprises, and how and where are those opportunities? And maybe that's a gap in my knowledge, but I just want to feel like Scotland is doing enough to show that as a social enterprise, it is the best way to do business.
Thanks, Jenna. Good question. Chris, maybe come to you first on this one. I know you've spoken a bit about innovation recently.
Yeah, I suppose. Great question, by the way, and I could probably spend all day discussing that. I'm happy to pick up separately if that's helpful. I think in general, another focus of the next action plan should be very much around innovation and I suppose succession planning as well, to make sure that the linking in a wee bit to what Elsa's saying around bringing more voices along and actually thinking of the leaders of the future in terms of the is there enough support for those sort of organisations that you've just mentioned? I think that given where we are by national standards, we do pretty well. Now, I'm not sure if there's gaps necessarily. I'm happy to be told that there are, incidentally. I'm just not sure that there are. But it may be that it's just that the provision that is there at the moment isn't sufficient. So what does that look like? That will throw more funding through various different means, it could expand what's already there. But if there's a specific gap, be absolutely delighted to have that conversation to see how we can fill that, because we've done that in the past quite successfully. But we just need to understand what that might be.
Thanks, Chris. I'm going to, I think, bring Kieran in. Do you want to say a few words on in response to that question as well? And then Martin, I might come to you next, because I know you've talked a lot about this too.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Personally, I think there is a lot of support out there. I think it goes back to the earlier kind of point about actually how we communicate and navigate that support and make sure that as a sector we're joined up there. In terms of, I think, thinking about doing business, certainly I am, at a personal level, and the organisation I work for is very interested in the kind of business element, I guess, of social enterprise, and thinking about actually how can you get your route to market, what is that route to market? And personally, I think there are huge opportunities within certain sectors, thinking about commercial and business-to-business relationships, that type of thing. And I think that's perhaps an area of support. I think within the social enterprise sector, there's a lot of support there, and actually we have great networks, but actually thinking about networks outside of the sector, I think there's an opportunity there, which we can all explore as a sector. So I think there is a lot of support there. It's about identifying, navigating it, and I think, yeah, thinking about different ways to get private sector, maybe public sector opportunities into social enterprise.
Thanks, Kieran. Martin, did you want to add anything?
Or why not be different? I'll say no, there's not enough support out there, or you wouldn't be asking the question, Gemma, is probably what's in my mind. It's not to say there isn't fantastic support out there. You know, folks like CIS Ventures and CIS are certainly trying to push into that space as well. Certainly CIS has worked with universities over the last couple of years. It's been quite a long, slow burn, but we're starting to see the first spin-outs, or we have seen the first spin-outs of universities coming from university innovation departments for social enterprises as well. So there's a lot of stuff going out there. I don't think you would be asking the question if the answer was yes, there is enough support out there. What there's probably not enough of for the minute is ambition to create social enterprises like that, if I'm being absolutely honest. I think over the last couple of years, social enterprises have naturally, because they were the first and last line of defence alongside the wider third sector in things like COVID, in the cost of living crisis, in the face of austerity, we've been quite focused on what, my own personal mind, is one very important side of the social enterprise spectrum, which is dealing with state and market failure in our most disadvantaged communities and ensuring that everybody has access to the quality of life that they deserve. But if we really want to make further inroads into the wider economy, we have to have a new, to my mind, mission-driven approach to say how can we bring the most financially powerful parts of the economy into ownership, which is more socially focused or cooperatively owned as well. So I think, you know, potentially the next action plan, having some real clear ambition there and seeing some more joined up partnership working around the topic of social innovation might be worthwhile. So I think there's a lot of great stuff out there, but we can always do more.
Thanks, Martin. Jenna, I think we've got a few comments in the chat there, just responding to your question as well. So obviously we'll be saving the recording and looking at some of these following the call as well. So I think this is definitely something that we can pick up. Margot, will come to you next.
Yeah, thanks. It was just really to follow on from what Kieran said. So I'm from Talking Matt's Social Enterprise, and we started off as a spin-off from Stirling University in 2011. So we've been going quite a long time as a social enterprise, and we're really proud to be a social enterprise, but fundamentally we're also a business. And I think there is support out there. I, for example, have just attended the Help to Grow course at Stirling University, which I found particularly useful in building up my own business knowledge. my own background is as a speech and language therapist, so I'm learning all the time. But I think it's really important for business leaders to understand the business world. And I think having that broader base understanding of how to run a business and what the key aspects are in business really helped me. I think there's just a couple of things that I would really like to see going forward in the sector. And I personally benefited a lot from having a mentor during my Help to Grow course at Stirling University. And I think having a business mentor within the sector is a really good way to go. Also, from our perspective, we received funding we got a SMART award from Scottish Enterprise, a feasibility grant looking at our digital talking mat and combining that with some AI. And we're coming to an end to that piece of work. So we will be looking for more investment for phase 2. But I think it is so important, I think, for us to look out with our sector as well as what is available inside the sector. I don't know if any of you have had the same issues around people paying, but at the moment we're having some issues with just getting people to pay. And I wonder if local authorities, healthcare trusts and so on could be encouraged to pay social enterprises promptly so that we don't have to have this continual sort of debt chase. But these are just a few comments to add to the discussion.
Thanks, Margot. I think lots of people would echo that last comment around people paying invoices a bit quicker. Douglas, I'll come to you first.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, I suppose I don't want to add too much to that, but I think certainly what I see is we see a lot of innovation. I think there's more innovation than people think. I think there's a huge amount of innovation on the ground, and the days of people saying they want to develop an enterprise and it's a cafe or a gardening business are long gone. There's lots of incredibly interesting ideas. I think so, I would agree with some of the comments that support needs to be appropriate, needs to be skilled, and there needs to be access to funding, which I think Pauline had mentioned. I think the only thing I wanted to add to that is I think we've been doing a lot of thinking and talking. I had a meeting the other day with Corporate Development Scotland, for example, about innovative models and different models. I think we're a wee bit stuck. So a lot of the social enterprises that we work with in Just Enterprise, we are still a traditional voluntary board, company liability guarantee with a paid member of staff, and that people are struggling to get board members and all of that. And you know that we invented that in Victorian times. I think those, not that it's dead in the water by any means, but I think there's a innovation can be driven not just by money and support, but by light touch and good and clever governance models.
Thanks, Douglas. Is there any other questions just now? Chris has to leave in the next few minutes, so if anyone's got any direct questions for Chris before he goes, please just raise your hand now. Nothing? Okay. Chris, I don't know if you've got any kind of closing remarks if you want to say. I did promise I would get you off the call in time for a quick break before your next meeting.
No, thank you. Yeah, and apologies, I've got a clash with support Mr. Arthur in a few minutes. I suppose there's obviously quite a lot of wide-ranging things that need to be developed moving forward, but I think Kim, there's probably a role for us getting together to work out. There will obviously be a more much more, I suppose, consultation, engagement, etc. That I know you're planning in terms of over the next wee while for the next action plan. But a lot of these points are really quite important, and unfortunately, the last bit dropped out. But the part that I heard around payments being made on time, for instance, that's just that's one that should be happening. There's guidelines there, so actually it's how do we collect that information to work out whether or not it's a problem, and how big a problem, and where is that problem. I'm sure we could all find isolated instances, and I'm not suggesting that it is isolated, by the way, but we need to sort of build up a bit of a picture, and then we can start sort of looking to how we fix some of those problems. But I think really it's about, my message is really it now is really the time to start talking about what we need for the future, and what have we maybe not quite hit the mark with over the last few years, and we still need to continue as well, because as I say, government funding and the support and our focus over the next 3 years is directly related to what happens over the next wee while. But thank you.
Thanks, Chris, and I'll let you just disappear off now if you need to head. But thanks for your contribution this afternoon, and I'll be in touch. Thank you. So yeah, just back to the floor if there's any other questions or reflections. I know that there's lots of people on this call like myself who've been around for a long time, and we're here when the strategy was developed and the action plans that are supporting it. So and as we kind of head into planning the consultation around the next action plan, it's really useful to hear some views and thoughts from all of you. Could just start picking in people. Oh, Tracy.
Hi everyone, and thanks to Chris and to Douglas for just chatting away there previously. Just a question I'd like to ask to Douglas, actually, if it's okay. So previously, before the intermediary came together, we obviously had these Senscott networks, and we had P4P and all these types of things. What's the plans going forward to firstly support our social entrepreneurs with contracting, and also to support the previous networks? What is the plan? Will that go out to consultation again, or what's your plans, Douglas?
Well, if you want me to be honest, I don't really have any personal plans, but if you want Social Enterprise Scotland's view on this, is that they are incredibly important. And if anything was lost in the development of the new single interface, that's the biggest loss. I think I mentioned that earlier on, or hinted at it. Maybe I can say it a bit more overtly now. The value of those networks, the geographical networks as they were growing, they were always very, very vulnerable. You can see them coming and going, some with limited support, some with more so. The thematic networks in particular were incredibly powerful, looking at health and sport and employability and all of that. That's been a real loss as the change has happened. And I think I've certainly been speaking to Kim and the team and Brian actually about helping to strengthen that going forward. So Tracy, it's a real priority. And I think you can really see as we've lost a lot of capacity, where Senscott used to really focus on these networks, and Social Enterprise Scotland have now got a remit to do that, but don't have anywhere near the resource. They've got a fraction of the resource that they used to have. And some of the people are in this room who looked after those networks might have a view, but there's a fraction of their view to support those networks. And as soon as you withdraw that support, light touch though it was, it's very hard. So I would say it's a big priority. And for me, it's the one big thing that we've really lost over the transition period to the new interface.
And I think it was, can't remember who said it about collaboration, but you know, there's a wealth of knowledge within the sector, and it's great to see Yvonne McBride on the call as well, and the amazing work she's doing with the new initiatives. But in terms of that side of things, our social entrepreneurs are calling out for that type of support. And, you know, we've gone in partnership with a corporate to support a procurement readiness programme. So, you know, there's other ways you can do things, and it's just maybe it's something that going forward we collectively come together and look at how we can support the sector going forward, because there's only so much, you know, that Just Enterprise can do. There's bound to be limits to what they can do as well. But as a sector, I think we're missing a trick here, because there are other providers out there that can actually support. So I think it would be amazing to do that and come together and maybe get some heads around the table.
I think that's right. I will pass to Keir in a second, but I think that partnership I mentioned is crucially important. But the other thing I would say is, as far as I'm concerned, I'm sure Martin at Just Enterprise would agree, and others, that it's a reactive programme. We've not created a firm programme and said to people, you must slot in with this. It's pretty much largely 3 days. And as long as there's a skill set around those 60 or 70 business advisors across Scotland, you know, and it should be responsive. So Tracy, all I would say is people should come to those and say, I need this kind of support. And if those support providers can't provide that because they don't have the skills, then they need to adapt and sort that out. So it needs to be responsive. So I would just say, you know, let's come and ask for that support. And you know, we as a support providers need to adapt to the need that's developing, because it's maturing very, very quickly.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Tracy. Thanks, Douglas. I'll just jump in there before I hand over to Kieran as well, just on the networks, Tracy, and totally agree that we've kind of lost some of them. We've lost some of that specialist support that we had at Senscott around the networks, but we're certainly looking at how do we support those thematic networks. So we're already working in partnership with the Creative Entrepreneurs Club to support a creative network which is online, and we've got 110 members in that group. So we've kind of tried to keep the creative Sen going in a new format. We're engaging with Sport Scotland, so we're hoping to be able to resurrect the sport network in the next couple of months. And I'm talking to Health and Social Care Alliance about working in partnership with them to support a health Sen going forward as well. And we've been keeping our hands in the kind of employability agenda. Jane, I'm pointing because she's sitting next to me, still represents social enterprise on the third sector employability forum, so we've kind of kept our hand in there as well. So they've been a bit more kind of under the radar, but we're kind of looking to develop the networks over this year, and we're certainly working much closer with the local networks than previously as well. So we've taken on the secretariat for the SEN and TSI managers group, which just means that we're connected in with the local networks. So it's certainly something that's a work in progress, but we've got a wee bit of a way to go.
Good to hear.
Thanks, Tracy. Kieran?
Yeah, just a couple of observations, I think, on the back of some of those things. I'm kind of seeing, and I think we're seeing quite a kind of difference in terms of levels of interest within the sector, which I think is encouraging over the past 6 months. It kind of feels that, I don't know, we've been in such a kind of period of crisis, I think, for the past year. And going back to Martin's point before about a lot of the focus of the support has been in that kind of crisis mode. And personally, I'm quite encouraged about some of the kind of support and some of the attendance at some events being a lot higher than it has been previously. I think we have lost something with the loss of the SENS, just to kind of echo that. And also, I think in general, people I'm speaking to in general have said, I feel out of the loop. And actually, I think that actually there aren't really many loops at the moment. We've kind of lost a lot of them. And actually, you know, we're really focusing quite a lot on thinking about actually so the SENS have gone, but then more generally, opportunities to network in a different way. No one's going to go to the normal sort of things where you go to do a general networking thing after office time, because that doesn't exist. So something with a clear purpose, I think, is really important, and that's kind of what I'm quite interested in myself. Tracy's point there about making links with the private sector, public sector, I think that's hugely important again as well. Again, thinking about not just networking for networking's sake, what's the point in actually having these things to go to? And there's a vested interest for the public sector and private sector to want to engage with social enterprise and vice versa. So I think that's just more observations than anything else, but I'm more encouraged now than I have been in the past 12 months, I think.
Thanks, Kieran. I think that's a nice way to wrap us up for this bit of the session. Thanks everybody for your contributions, your participation. We'll share the recording and the slides, as I said, and we'll gather together the comments. This is really the kind of starting point for us, I guess, in terms of thinking about the next action plan. So we will be back in touch. We'll be sharing in our own social media, newsletter, etc., how people can get, or how organisations can get involved in the process as we're going forward. So kind of watch this space, and we'll be sharing that information in the next couple of weeks.